So do you want to know my hilarious name for the episode? That my working title for the episode?
Well, it's not going to be Brothers War Story Review the Past, to keep in line with all the other story review episodes.
Well, yeah, of course, that's probably what you're going to name it. Yeah, of course, that's what you're going to name it. But I mean, I had it as Frenetic Differences, like frère is in like the French for brother. Good, great. I'm glad you love it.
Welcome to Magic the Flavouring, the Magic the Gathering podcast, where we talk about all things Magic Flow design and lore. I'm your host, Andy Mann.
Hello, this is Nathan Cancel.
And today, we're going to be talking through the, I'm going to say first half, the main quote-unquote stories from the Brothers War online web fiction. Online web fiction. That's what other kind of web fiction is there? Offline? We're going to be chatting through all of the Miguel Lopez stories today. And, whoo boy, is there a lot of it for only 5 episodes.
Yeah, what I mean, it's funny you say the first half and then you did the quote-unquote main story, because I very much feel like this is weird because the main story feels like side stories because it's not concurrent with the, our present day, as an audience. Like, we are currently sat with Teferi and Kaya and Saheeli trying to figure out how to go back in time. But actually the main story is, because it's a set in the past, the main story is actually these little vignettes that we've got. And the side stories are actually the concurrent present day story, which is kind of a reversal of what you normally get. And it does feel odd having the main set be set in the past. It feels like a side story set, kind of in that fashion, which I guess we never really knew how it was going to come across, because it's the first time they've kind of done a throwback set, and we've kind of talked about how we wanted there to be throwback sets because it gets to fill in narrative, plot points and stuff, and it gets us, the new folks, the new wave, the post-mending MTG players, kind of a chance to look at a really poignant part of history. And I feel like it's done really, really well, but there are certain things that just feel a little bit strange. And I think one of those is that we've got this really dense narrative that is completely irrelevant kind of to the modern story, and you could ignore all of this and it could still be part of that. Yada yada, Brothers War happened years ago. I don't really need to know about that. It was 4,500 years ago in the past. Who gives a shit? Where's Bolas and Emrakul? Why aren't we talking about them more?
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of thing where these stories are set, correct me if I'm wrong, they are set after the books that covered the Brothers War all the way back.
Some yay, some nay.
Well, so it jumps around. It all jumps around, obviously, because the whole nature of the stories, which Nathan will do kind of a sort of semi-breakdown, because there's actually a lot too much to do our traditional breakdowns, really. It jumps all over the timeline because we're following Teferi doing some time travel stuff, even in both halves, the chapters of the side story and the episodes of the main one. But for example, the first episode by Minguez, The End, I think it's called, starts at the end. It's like carrying directly on from the books, and then it all kind of loops back around. So that's what I mean by it's all new content. It's not covering the stuff that's in the books that people should already be familiar with, and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, we don't see any repetition. We specifically don't see the point of view of Urza or Mishra, apart from one little bit at the end that we'll get to. And all of the side stories are kind of, they're low to the ground. As I described it, I put that it's 5 vignettes depicting the low to the ground stories of the Brothers War, the escalation and the aftermath of it from the point of view of the people, not from the the protagonist, antagonist, if we call Urza and Mishra those people. We see the soldiers from both sides tackling the day-to-day reality of prolonged warfare and the effect Urza and Mishra's feud, the effect that has wrought on the land and the citizens of Terrasier. I realized in that YouTube video I did about Urzalands, I mispronounced Terrasier every time. It's too late to go back and change it now. So I'm going to try and rectify that now. But geez, yeah, Terrasier.
Sure. I mean, let's talk a little bit about Miguel Lopez for a start. So Miguel Lopez has been a part of Magic Story since Zendikar Rising. He wrote two of our favourite stories from Zendikar Rising, which was Red Root and Magosi Steppes. And then he also wrote in Kaldheim, he wrote potentially my favourite story, and I can't remember what your take was on it. He wrote Direction, Purpose, Honour and Glory, which was the side story detailing the spirits of Istfell, and the kind of warrior spirit who was on the last little mission and kind of confronted Egon, the god of death. Also wrote the Planeswalker's Guide to Streets of New Capenna, and I remember every time Lopez's name popped up, us just kind of going, "Oh, this guy's fucking great, isn't he? Like, Jesus Christ, like, what a writer for Magic."
What a voice.
Yeah, what a voice. And, you know, we were talking just before we started recording, and this will come up later in sort of how I sort of approach these stories and what I felt about them, both positive and negative. But we wanted more of Miguel Lopez, and we absolutely got it, because the word count on these stories, I did a little experiment, like literally just before we hit record, where I looked at the word count for episode 1, The End, and then I did the same word counts for the first story of both Kaldheim and Crimson Vow. I just picked two at random off the page. Both of those, Crimson Vow and Kaldheim, are popping in at just over 4,000 words. Each one of these stories is like 8,000 plus. That we're getting double the amount of fiction from Miguel Lopez here. It's absolutely nuts. It's crazy. Like literally double the amount of content, which is a big swing.
It is, and you can clearly tell that he's not just kind of like fumbling around aimlessly filling gaps in. Like, he clearly has a very good knowledge of the characters that we see, and we're seeing characters that, we haven't seen for decades, and the world building itself, like the expansion. It's not really world building because the world is built. We've already had this. If you want to go and read the Brothers' War, go and read the Brothers' War. It's not a bad book, but he clearly has, and the work that he's doing here is it's really what's the word I'm looking for? True to old Magic. It's not retconning anything. It's a lovely voice, and it's one of these. I said this in one of our little like WhatsApp groups that we have, because obviously as MTG players, we have like 6 different WhatsApp groups dedicated to Magic, and one of them I was saying, it's one of the first times I've kind of like sunk into the story to the point of where like I kind of, the world around me disappears, and I start like falling into the Brothers' War, as it were. And every chapter I was like, as much as I could feel like, bloody hell, is this still going? And you do that little thing of you scroll down a little bit just to see how much is left, and you're like, oh my god, we're already halfway through, okay, never mind. Like, and every time I'd still feel like I wanted the story to go on longer.
Yeah.
So it really does show that he hooks your imagination in, and he really delivers on it. There's episode 4. I mean, we'll get to this afterwards, but like considering it's all about war, it could have felt very samey. And it's one of the things that's always been an issue with Magic narrative, is that the action is a bit shit, and the dialogue can sometimes be a bit flat. And both
sometimes
the action,
sometimes.
That's what I mean. But the action in this is all enthralling, and the voices that we hear are all unique, and all have their own personality, and they don't all just speak in the same voice, which sometimes you can kind of have when you've got 7 different planeswalkers all talking together, and they all just kind of sound like they're speaking the same direct purpose. Whereas here, everyone has their own intention; they only have their own patter. It's really lovely. If these are the only stories you're going to read out like over the last 6 months, I'd recommend it, because it doesn't feel like you need to know anything else that's going on in the story to enjoy them. They feel like they are nice standalone narrative pieces, and again, it's a throwback to a part of Magic lore that you might not know about, and again, it presents it in a way that's a little bit more harrowing, and a little bit more heartbreaking. But considering we've got 5 episodes to crack through, which is, we're only doing the half of them today. We're only going to do the past stories. We'll do the current, concurrent, the chapters as they were. We'll do the chapters next week. We'll do the episodes today, just because both will require its individual, I think, perspective. So I am, if that's okay with you, just going to crack on through, because I've got, not 8,000 words to get through, but I mean, I had 40,000 words to get through and summarize.
Yeah, go for it.
So we're going to start with episode 1, known as The End. We are on a snowy night, the first signs of the impending ice age that's inexorably alluded to throughout the story. And we're following Kayla bin Krug. This is Urza's wife and the princess to Yosha during the Brothers' War, who is now the queen of Yosha now that the dust has settled, who laments on the tragic end of the Brothers' War, the Silex detonation having just happened. She currently presides over the ruined city of Penregan. At the end of a long council meeting with an old man, an old man arrives. This is Tornos, Urza's assistant, who Kayla knows all too well. They talk of the war, of her son Harbin's death, and the potential to build new machines to help rebuild the city. Tornos also reveals that Urza is still alive, although in a different form. Interestingly, we see this interaction much later in the episodes. We see it in episode 5, right at the end. It kind of works as a bookend. Tornos sets to retrieving Power Stones for his civil automatons, while the scout captain Miral, who is not listed as a they throughout the story, which is more non-binary representation, always good to see. Miral reports that a long procession of people, a ragtag army of sorts, has gathered on the other side of the Care Mountains. They attempt to repair the city wall before spring, when the procession will cross the mountains into their territory. When spring comes and the Horde approaches the city, Kayla goes to meet their emissaries, who reveal that they are an anti-machine crusade on their way to destroy Urza's tower. Now, this is the beginning of the Church of Tau, whose motto is "Suffer not a magician to live." This is kind of like the aftermath of being against magic and mechanized machines. You know, like both aspects of the war, you know, that they feel like can be got rid of now. You know, we don't need magic, we don't need artifice. She offers them supplies, but no quarters. Eventually, the zealous warriors learn that the city of Penregon is harboring machine demons, as they put it, and things become heated. Kayla musters the troops and arms the automatons. The horde of pilgrims, called Talites, after the Church of Tau, are now offering Kayla an ultimatum: forsake the machines or die. And this particular episode ends the night before the confrontation is set to happen. As we move into episode 2, the beginning, it shows the aftermath. Penregan wins the fight, but it's a Pyrrhic victory, and also Tornos snaps, deciding that he's been tainted by a lifetime of designing war machines. You know, he started off as a toy maker, as a tinkerer, and you know, as he reflects on this and now what he's wrought, what his can we call it science? I guess we can call it science, right? His artifice, seeing what that's kind of developed and what it's developed into over the years, he decides to burn down his workshop along with himself. Or I mean, for intents and purposes, he disappears, and Kayla never sees him again. The city dies slowly over a decade as the Ice Age truly starts. We start seeing the encroaching glaciers, reports of glaciers coming down from the south, wildlife changing over the course of years. Each spring starting later, each winter coming earlier. Most people abandon it to move to the west. They have scouting parties that are going out to the west, reporting of different towns that people are willing to go to and seek out their future prospects, because the city is clearly falling to its death. Kyla discovers that she can do magic, which is a really nice point. I think it was nice to see a moment of mage craft kind of in its infancy during a time where technology was the predominant form of magic on the plane. It's a kind of pyromancy or controlling of heat through her hands that we see. Eventually, she's forced to abandon the city too and to go west to New Yosha. She has a discussion with her grandson about a magic academy being founded. This is the Conclave of Mages, a citadel that's built by Ashnod and Tornos on the site of the monastery of Gix on Dominaria during the Dark Age. This is to study both artifice and magic. It's actually, weirdly enough, surrounded by the Maze of Ith. She then continues west to Krug, ruled by the warlord Fask. We then, right at the end, we almost get a little epilogue, cutting to Fask's point of view, who's getting really paranoid about a curse, a witch supposedly laid on him. In the middle of one night, he sees a spectre in his chambers, and it's because he's basically set up all of these little ropes with cans and chimes and stuff on. So if anyone was to enter his room, he could hear them, because he's got paranoia. Being a warlord, obviously people want to assassinate him. And the Spectre's presence drives him mad. We cut to the present day, where it's revealed that the Spectre was Teferi, trying to do temporal viewing of the past, and accidentally revealed himself to the Warlord. The temporal anchor that Sahili has constructed clearly needs recalibration. Despite his influence that night echoing through generations of stories, so as in like the Warlord tells of the Spectre, and then that Spectre's story gets told to his children, to their children, none of this really matters, because the following Ice Age obliterates any change that Teferi might have had on history, along with the rest of the world. We now move on to episode 3, Sword 1. Now, this is a contained story of Mishra's sacking of Krug. We follow Samwell, one of 5 Avenger pilots, on a recruit's first day at war kind of story. A dragon engine attacks, most likely Traxos, and there is lots of, as I put here, lots of well-written action, but pretty much everybody dies. Leaders on both sides are massacred. At the end, a ghost of death is seen by a wounded soldier. The soldier thinks it has come for him, but the ghost ends up being yet another vision of Teferi, who says not yet to him, but it actually is referring to his own placement in the timeline to Kaya. But the soldier, hearing this, saying not yet, actually ends up living for many years afterwards. Another sign of Teferi's permanent effects on the past. You know, everyone was worried that, is Teferi going back going to fuck things up? He's like, I'm just going back in spirit. Clearly, Teferi never learns anything about time, despite being the best chronomancer. What an idiot. Anyway, then we move on to episode 4, The Ink of the Empire, which I personally have as like my favourite out of the 5. This is mostly a tone and flavour piece about the everyday life of the Falaji trenches. So this is Mishra's forces that we're seeing. All 3 of the other stories we've seen are kind of from the point of view of Urza's, side, whereas this we're seeing the troops from the Falaji nation. Our perspective is from 2 people, Farid and Karak, seasoned soldiers of the contested trench lines. They greet a new wave of naive recruits, understanding that there is a new mobilized attack on the Argivan forces upcoming. Ashnod's transmigrants, which are described in horrible visceral detail. We all thought we were done with the body horror. Now the Dominaria United's done. Oh no, this is worse. It's so much worse. So we see them joining the front to bolster the forces. We get a moment to comment and reflect on the human lives caught between the brothers' machines and monsters, the human cost to both nations. Farid and Karak, along with 2 other troops, masquerade as a night patrol to sneak out across no man's land to trade with the enemy. We have a beautiful moment between the 2 sides, similar to the 1914 Christmas Day football game between the British and the German forces that happened during World War I. They give information to the other side of the incoming attack, one that the Argivan command was already aware of and preparing for. Clearly, neither side, like in terms of ground forces, are in support of the continuing brutality. Our protagonists agree to hold back as much as possible in the attack and let the mechs and monsters fight each other, essentially killing off themselves and not having to, incur any more human death, and try and stay alive in spite of the oncoming slaughter. The attack over, we don't actually see the attack. It's mostly just a bombardment that we see, and we see them kind of go as the last wave. This is for it incorrect. We see them go over as the last wave. By the time they reach the trenches, the fight's over. The trenches are routed, and the Falaji front then continues to move once again, ever forward as the contest for territory and war continues. At the end, again, we get another little epilogue of our resident ghost and ghoulie Teferi, our time ghost, we'll call him. He's then searching the ruined battlefields, clearly still at the wrong point in time. He's seeking the climatic final battle at Argoth, where the Silax's detonation was set. There's a group of augmented scavengers that certainly seems to be part of the Society of Gix. They approach him in his phantom form. He freaks out and then leaves them behind. We then move into episode 5, As Cruel as Necessary. And our final chapter, this is one that's more focused on the point of view of Teferi, as we get more perspective on his, Kaya, and Sahili's attempts on the temporal travel using the anchor. Teferi still can't figure out how the Silex works, so he goes through time to talk to us. So we get a lovely bit of kind of like well-being about how he sees traveling through time. It's kind of considered to be like this tapestry that's all woven, and he's a needle kind of going through different holes within the tapestry. And he kind of talks about the time of the final battle as being almost like a scar, a blotted scar that he can't penetrate, that he almost like, as he tries to approach it, it kind of almost naturally circumnavigates him, because he kind of sees it as any action that happens is almost like cutting the tapestry and all the threads that go off of it, or all the different timeline, possibilities that happen. If he's going back in time, this is time that's already woven, together. And because so much stuff, or so many lives were ended, so many potential futures were ended in the cataclysm that he caused, it kind of has almost like this scarification on the tapestry of time, which is described really, really, really well. Because he can't figure out, he goes back through time to talk to Urza at the very moment of Urza's spark igniting. We see him activate the Silax using his own blood and tears pouring into the vessel as the monstrous form of Mishra-fused dragon engine looms ever closer. He misses the activation on the first time, but as he travels back one last time, he finds a lake of time, a moment at the point of Urza's ignition that they can pause and talk amidst the cataclysm's detonation. It's almost like time because Teferi does a thing where he halves time again and again and again and again and again, to the point of where that's how he's essentially slowing time down, is he's halving time each time. But it's almost like in the grand river of time, as he's explaining it to us, this moment they're in is a lake where all of the time has stopped, and they have a moment to be able to talk within it. He's unsure of what the exact nature of this. Urza's kind of unsure of the exact nature of this, but it's almost like a little bubble they get to talk in. During the conversation, we see Urza die as a human and reform as an old walker. Like all of his flesh and bones kind of crumble away, and then his body reforms around his spark. I mean, considering this is an old walker, so back then they didn't even need their bodies. They could exist, and their bodies were almost like a figment of their own imagination of how they wanted to be seen. They could reform themselves however they wanted. Urza tells Teferi that trigger for the Silex isn't a spell or an incantation, but a person. Urza sacrificed himself to activate the Silex. He literally poured himself into it to fill it. Teferi is very candid about events yet to transpire in Urza's history in this conversation, although he never has a chance to mention what his name is to him. Urza likely won't remember this conversation, it's mentioned, because as soon as time then restarts, it's almost as if that lake was a moment in the river, and the river's already moving. There's no, you didn't have a moment to contemplate on the conversation that's happening. So it's never really made certain if he does remember any of the stuff that happens, but it's kind of alluded to that he won't. The time flow then continues as normal as Teferi departs back to the present. That's the last we see of Teferi in this episode. Our epilogue instead is Urza, now a planeswalker, speaking to Tornos after the cataclysm. He finds Tornos in his coffin, which he stays in, I think, something like 5 years to be able to protect himself from the battle. And then this is the conversation that we alluded to at the beginning in episode 1, where he spoke to Urza, and Urza was someone, and he tells Kayla how Urza isn't dead. He has now become something more. The episode ends with Tornos noticing the first flakes of snow falling, a reminder of the Ice Age and the death of the world to follow. And that's it. 5 little
well done.
Lovely stories. Episode 1 and 2 being kind of a part 1, part 2, and then each of the other ones kind of having its own standalone effect. Yeah. I mean, I obviously glossed over a lot of, because I factualized it, but everything within there was uttered so fantastically. What a voice. What did you think, Andy? What did you think?
Well, as someone who admittedly isn't as hot on the Brothers' War era of stories, and honestly sort of considers them to be wonderful baseline for Magic, and obviously for the people who really love them, the kind of, that is what Magic was for the longest time, but something that suffered from endless amounts of books that weren't very well written. Some were a lot better. The fact that Dominaria was this huge landmass and every single culture was so utterly detailed and realized and all this kind of thing. Like it's not the most accessible story. So as someone who has often struggled with, knowing the capital city of a province, of a continent, of a side of a planet that we haven't been to properly in a long time, I found these stories to be really enjoyable and actually a lot more accessible than I thought they would have been. The first 2 being the end and the beginning, which, for a start, I don't know if Lopez is the one who chooses the names of the stories, but because it's not always the case. But I mean, if they are, then it's really well written. The first 2 following Caleb and Krug directly after the events of the Brothers' War, bringing in Tornos and kind of spinning all those, stories out to set up the stage for the following 3 episodes to follow, I thought was a really clever idea. And they managed to do it without patronizing or kind of playing down the wealth of knowledge that's behind these stories. Like, they didn't explain too explicitly who Kayla was, at least not in an exposition dump. It was done quite naturally through her thoughts and emotions. They didn't too explicitly on the nose explain who Tornos was. Again, it was fairly naturally played out in his role during this kind of time period. And I sort of, we are introduced to these characters through names. Like Krug is a name that's appeared on like Magic cards. If I'm talking about Magic cards from say like the 2018 Dominaria set forwards, because I know obviously, that's 4 to 5 years ago now. But if I'm considering this little pocket of Magic, we've been to Dominaria twice. And a lot of these stories kind of pop up in the Commander products. Tornos got a card in, I think it's 2018. I think it was the 2018 Commander product. I can't quite remember. It's the one which was the Saheeli Planeswalker deck. Anyway, I think it was a huge task. Maybe even a bigger task than, say, wrapping up storylines for things like War of the Spark, for example, or doing these big sort of endgame-esque things. I think this was a huge task to do the Brothers' War, to do the first Throwback Set, and ultimately it was made incredibly accessible, even the difficult first 2 episodes, and then episodes 3, 4, and 5 being kind of its own thing again, I think were really well set up and really nice little contained stories. So ultimately, I fucking loved it. I do think, and this is me immediately being the hypocrite of, we need more magic story, and then literally getting double the word count and going, oh, maybe too much. Like, this was a book. This was a novella, essentially, which is fine, but when you're not expecting it, when you want, like, when I sat down to be like, cool, I'm going to take the time to read these stories, and I'm not the fastest reader, and it was still taking me like an hour and a bit to get through each one. Like, oh, I'm a working man, Nathan. Like, I don't know how much time I have. Do you know what I mean? So I don't know. That was my only criticism. But if that's the only criticism, is the fact that we got too much of it, I think that's kind of fine, ultimately speaking.
Yeah, I think, like, if you were to read them individually, like, so that's why I read them like 1, because they came out, 1 and 2 came out on the same day, and then 3 and 4 came out on the same day, and then 5 came out alone. Doing both stories in one day was actually quite a task. Like, I've restarted work recently. I'm only a half-hour journey from work. I don't think I managed to finish the story on the way there and back. So I actually had to, like, put concerted, like, time aside to digest them, and they did take digesting. Like, Lopez's really writing style isn't easy. I don't want to say the word easy as in, like, it's not difficult. It's just you want to take your time with it. You want to indulge in it. There's some fantastic language use that you really kind of want to let wash over you. You don't want to skim, and especially if you're trying to catch up on a load of stories, as you say, like, they're not pandering to the new people with a load of exposition, but at the same time there is a lot of dense facts in there and a lot of things that if you're not aware of these people or what's happening, you kind of want to get every little bit of detail as well. And again, this part of the story is never documented anyway, like this immediate aftermath. Like, we've seen the sacking of Krug in the Brothers' War, but we didn't see it from the point of view of the soldiers. But we have never seen this little tiny bit just after the cataclysm. We haven't seen Kayla's kind of, as you said, like her response, and everything. And I think that's really, really important for older Magic, like Vorthoses as well as players, because they get a little bit more. It's like they can go, oh, I can ignore it. It's not relevant. I've already read it all before. It's like, no. There's actually new stuff, and it's stuff that you do want to add to your knowledge. And I think she comes across really well. Like, there's no deference to words. It's actually really nice to see, because we know that Urs is a dick. We've known, but it's nice to get it almost like from a personal point of view, like from the wife and the student. Like, that's a really important perspective to get on him, because it kind of, Urs's voice is always going to be kind of like beyond reproach. We do get a little bit of his voice at the end of episode 5, and throughout the whole time, I'm like, it's very hard to relate to him from his point of view. It's much easier to relate to him from other people's point of view of him. He has literally just destroyed an entire. He is a scourge. People absolutely hate him and despise him, despite his necessities. And we even see in the moment, like, of when he detonated the Silex, like, I can understand, like, you can see his point of view. He's actively crying into the Silex, and I think Teferi mentioned that he's never seen his teacher express such emotion before. So it really gave, like, without bringing Urza back, I don't know how we can get more story of him apart from doing these kinds of things. And it was really nice to get some Urza story without bringing him back, because I don't think he should come back. And I think it was, as I say, a nice perspective to get on him.
For sure. I quite like the idea that, it's not just a set of stories being like, look how terrible these two men are, like, in terms of, as if Mishra and Urza were especially evil entities. Like, they do, like, the writing does make a really good job of making it relatable to our own world. Your favourite story, being episode 4, is a very World War I trenches. I'm saying World War I because that's obviously, as two Englishmen, that's the story we get told over and over again. All of our history lessons in secondary school covered the Tudors, World War I, and World War II. And that's all we learned about, because our education system is obsessed with it. So there are other wars, obviously, and trench warfare is something that appears all over the world. But to relate to our experience of, like, reference, it does feel very World War I-y. And you know, having the main characters wanting to survive, the idea that as one of the characters spouts, the lesson is your cloak and your boots are more important than this trench and the front line. The front lines can change daily. You might only get one set of boots and a cloak, you know, so protect them at all costs. You know, the kind of microcosm stories. Again, in that story, they talk about how they don't want to be just another notch of millions on a chalkboard for the princes of the world to look at ambivalently. You know, they are their own living, breathing, agency-filled people. And that's a really relatable way to look at these two warlords, these two princes of the universe in the terms of the brothers, as opposed to just being like, oh, Urza is callous and he ruined the world because he did all this stuff and all this kind of fantasy lore. And, you know, speaking as two Vorthoses who love fantasy lore, it can sometimes be a bit much, and it is just a lot easier to go like, hey, you know, the sort of allegory of the lions led by lions led by sheep, lions led by goats, donkeys, that's it, lions led by donkeys, which is what they said of the Tommies and the officers in World War One for the British Army. The fact that the lions were actually the ones at the front line who had bravery and were the ones really doing things, and the donkeys who knew fuck all about how actually the world was were the people sat in the front line, in the offices like 20 miles behind the front lines giving out orders. You know, it is a much more sort of grabbable idea, and I think it's executed brilliantly. My favourite story, actually, is Sword One, and it gave me huge anime vibes.
Yeah,
it's
a bit Attack on Titan-y,
massively Attack on Titan-y, massively
Full Metal Alchemist,
Gundam, all of these, any of these animes, which, and it is a lot of them, which follow either mechs or being like, hey, this 15-year-old child is now a soldier and is given this outrageous weapon to roam around the country, and like, you know, all of those, and that is sort of anime's obsession with this kind of stylized version of like steampunk Europe, right, and like Germanic Europe, fed through the anime lens, that's then fed back to us in the West, and then becomes, you know, part of our fantasy lore and our fantasy culture, which is what I think is a wonderful sort of like bouncing back and forth, and always have done.
Yeah, I did imagine it as a medieval London.
Yeah,
I was imagining
100%.
it with like beams and stone. You know, I wasn't imagining like Minas Tirith. I was imagining something that was way more like relatable to you know, to the cities that we had during those times.
In my mind, it was Attack on Titan. It was you know, very much how like Dranith was in Ikoria. I always said was like felt very Attack on Titan-y. That was my sort of like, you know, feeling, seeing these kids in these like rigs with all their you know, the protagonist in that story running around in his sweat-soaked jumpsuit with all of his pilot rigging, and he's got his control rod and his, even the name Sword One is mech, like his mech media, like personified, right? Just that kind of really hyper stylized name, Sword One. Yeah, just incredible. And even just like, I mean, I would be a fool if I said I understood Neon Genesis Evangelion. I don't understand Evangelion at all, even though I've watched it a few times now. But even the idea that there's a passage in that story where he sees Sword One, even though he's piloting Sword One seems to be displaying fighting prowess and movements that almost make it seem like it's living and it's kind of its own entity. Very much the way that the mechs in Evangelion are discovered to be, spoilers for Evangelion, something of like a sentient being themselves. You know, it's just this idea where I don't know. There's like a real sort of dark undercurrent to all of these stories that kind of makes them really relatable in a way that a lot of other Magic story just seems a little bit, even from the greatest writers, sometimes feels a little bit shallow. These stories had a lot of depth and a lot of undercurrents to them.
Yeah, it makes me feel like the humans are like, but the two parallels I see in these across all these is that the human lives are super important because those are the masses and numbers that make up the army and make up the you know, the sieges and the conquest and everything. But it keeps trying to point out just how insignificant they are compared to the increasing war machines that Urza and Mishra are bringing to the table. You know, like you have Samwell, who's like just some dude. There are only 5 of them. There are 5 little pilots, five of these Avengers, and within, I think, what must be a couple of minutes of getting enlisted, and they're running down into the city. A dragon engine, like fucking starts powering, and like the dragon engine, like they all go to the left to go and flank it, and as they go to the left, the entire rest of their squadron gets annihilated in one breath of fire, including their captain. And you're like, holy shit. And at that point, they both just kind of go, right, cool, we don't care about fighting the dragon anymore. Now it's just about fucking surviving. And one of like the three, there's only three of them left, and one of them is absolutely losing it. He starts screaming. They have to gag him. They have to gag him and then bring him along with it. It's like, it makes the humans feel like they're so irrelevant, but like their stories are so important. Because realistically, they're the ones who are going to rebuild after all of this. They're the ones that have to get up, like pick themselves up and carry on. That's what's great about episode 1 and 2 is that there's been the cataclysm. There's this, like, we know the world is going to end, you know, like obviously this is thousands upon thousands of years in the past, and there were 2 ice ages across Dominaria before we get to the modern time, and we know that the ice age is coming and what's going to follow afterwards, you know, the dark. But like we see that the effect that the war has on the day-to-day and on the individual, which I think again makes Magic Story, it's something that Magic Story misses a lot, because it's harder to relate to a pyromancer who can burn with the fire of the sun, you know, or who can speak to the soul of a world. Like those things aren't necessarily really relatable, but looking at the machine that you're piloting and how efficient it is at killing, and then wondering how that was programmed into it, that's really relatable, because that's something that even as a Magic reader, I sometimes read, it's like, how are they going to explain how mechs work, you know? Like, how do they program them, you know? How do they get what do they have, little silicon chips in with the binary 0-1 kind of programming? Who knows, you know? Because even like to this point, it's also interesting to see that magic wasn't really surfacing. The Thran, as much as they were really impressive 1,000 years ago, it wasn't magic that they were kind of harnessing, it was science. And I get this real feel from these stories that they're still so far in the past in terms of knowledge and understanding, that they still can't separate science from magic in terms of understanding which is which, you know. And Artificer Magic, I think, and Dominaria kind of end up falling into the same kind of regard anyway. It's just different systems of understanding. And it was kind of nice to have even Teferi trying to explain like his understanding of magic and how time works to Urza, who has obviously a much more simplistic understanding of things. I say simplistic as if Urza isn't really, really clever. But, you know, he was always known to not have the fanciful, artistic kind of view of things, which kind of explains why he always thought magic was something that was ridiculous. And it wasn't until he could feel the incantation on the Silex that he realized that there was something beyond, you know, science and electricity. There was this kind of magic that was present. And I feel like that's the kind of thing that gets really interesting, because you're tearing down these grand magic-y things. You know, it's not a school for mages and has all of the arcane magic in it. It's like, no, these are your ancestors trying to figure out the basics of how magic and science works, but then also how much that can be taken out of get out of hand. You know, that church of Tau coming in and basically not understanding that the machines can be used for anything other than bad. You know, they're so viciously against it, and they go sweeping across, and they're very successful. Like the Church of Tau is very successful for years, for generations onwards, until, you know, eventually the Ice Age takes over everything. So it's amazing to see the reaction from the Brothers' War. We expected to get like right in the heart of it, which we did. We get some battles right in the heart of it. We also get that aftermath of the Brothers' War and what it meant for the people and their understanding of how the world works, and having to just deal with, right, good, just got to carry on with more summers and more winters that are worse than they were before. Like, how are we going to survive? Like, that's human bleakness that's way easier to relate to, because magic doesn't typically get to do that very often.
Yeah. And do you know what's really interesting as well about, you mentioned the word bleakness there, and that I've just picked up on that. Because these stories are bleak, right? They are horrifying, and you know, just even the descriptions of like the dust. Again, going back to Sword 1, there's a moment where there's a gust of wind that hits them like sandpaper, and this is in the middle of them being attacked and like everything exploding around them, and you just think, fucking hell, like what is going on here? And if we compare these stories, right, to another story arc, which is considered to be among the bleaker of the Magic story arcs, which is the Amonkhet stories. Obviously, incredibly well written. We've espoused them many, many times. Anthony Tessitore came on the podcast and like has obviously had a huge hand in developing that world as well. So this isn't to knock Amonkhet at all. But if Amonkhet was bleak in a way of like, well, it's so bleak because there's just nothing, there's no hope. Bolas has won. This is just a horrible meat grinder society, and it felt very much like a downer. These stories are arguably more bleak in terms of a real world allegory, because there is war and all these stories have a rooted anchor in the world that we know, and especially these days there are currently wars going on in every continent. But there is also a huge amount of contemplation and hope, and it's not just a world full of violence and sacrifice. There is, there are moments of real humanity, and I don't know. It just doesn't seem quite as final, and maybe that's because we know Dominaria bounces back from these stories, and so Lopez is building in that hope as well, because he knows as the writer, hey, although these individual characters may be dying at these moments, the story does continue. Whereas in Amonkhet, the whole idea is that we didn't know where the story was going because it was a quote unquote present day set. Do you know what I mean? I don't know. It just has it has a different sense of bleakness, and it also has this sense of hope and philosophy that I think Magic has had a real hard time balancing. Sometimes it goes full in for the philosophy, and sometimes it goes full in for the battle, but it never really marries it up quite as well. I don't know.
Yeah, it was kind of almost that focus on humanity, right? It felt almost triumphant a little bit at times, because it was almost like in the face of this destruction, apocalyptic destruction, humans can still have that hope, that perseverance. We see seasoned veterans that have been through multiple different battles, and it just kind of says, I didn't expect to see another one. Like, it's just their day to day, like it's very encouraging to see when we don't, again, have those typical perspectives in Magic stories, because we're trying to grasp these overarching kind of magic systems and, different races of Valkyries and stuff crossing realms and having giant battles with demons like that. It doesn't relate as much as, as I think one of the best parts in episode 4 was this moment was good. This is just after they've started dealing with the enemy, right? They're doing their trades and everything for wares, and it says this moment was good. The war didn't make this moment happen. It happened despite the war. Farid looked from Eamon's broken smile to Laria's greying hair, Carrick's gaunt face to the bandaged brow of the Argivan soldier he compared and traded knives with. Farid was not a poet, but the beauty of this moment sat with him. He committed to the memory, the tragedy of this little piece. Their blood was the ink in which lord and emperors rewrote the borders of the world. Oh my God, it's so pretty, it's so lovely, it's so chewy, it's like, Lopez, what are you doing? Come on. And it's lovely, it's those moments of with all this shit going on, and it all just spurred from this little difference these bloody brothers had. And it's one of those kind of normally there's moments of, if this hadn't happened, there's no contemplation of that. It's like, this is happening, how are we dealing with it? How are we continuing to represent our humanity? As you said earlier, when you said your cloak and boot is more important than the trenches, protect yourself, because you are the thing that is living, and you are the thing that will continue, the legacy of the land. The land itself can perish. The land itself can rebuild itself, but it's the humanity that needs to kind of remain in the face of such, wanton destruction. It's just such a lovely collection. I think they did such a good job of representing just enough new information with just enough reality of things we kind of already knew about but never got a chance to see, so focused in on. And we even do get little glimpses of, Mishra at the end and Ezra at the end. But again, the amount they speak is very, very little, and it's good that they're kind of kept to the background, because as much as it is their war, that's not what this set's about. It's almost like what their war did to Dominaria is kind of what this set's all about. And I imagine once we get into the set properly, I mean, also, there's something to be said for getting all these stories before we start seeing cards released. We used to get really annoyed about how they used to do that. Now it's almost like we know the story, like what flavor notes are we going to see from the cards, like the reflections of the stories we've already read. Of course we get a few little bits of artwork throughout the stories, but it's kind of going to be nice to see, having now the knowledge of the Brothers' War in our head, very, very freshly, it's going to be much more relatable to the cards that we see, I think.
Well, I think this is the right way to do it. I think this is absolutely, because they started this with, well, they didn't start it, they kind of revisited, because they've always changed around how they do things, but they revisited this from Kamigawa forwards, right, as in Neon Kamigawa, Neon Dynasty, whatever, new one, where they have the story building up the expectation of what the cards are going to be, and with more and more people being interested in the lore and reading it, not by no means even half the Magic players in the world read the story, because there's too many of us for that to happen. But more and more people doing it, the expectations are kind of managed with what we're going to see. And the artwork does do a really good job of showing, everything's on fire. Everything's just molten metal and like war. So it's, it's good. Let's talk a little bit about episode 5, because that is probably the most different from all 5 of them, because it focuses in on Teferi, kind of dovetails into the chapters of the present day, because it is focusing on our planeswalkers doing all their time traveling.
It's arguably the only relevant one, like quote unquote relevant one.
Yes.
If you could miss the other 4 and it not matter, but if you
I see what you're saying.
Some consequence.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, but having said that, I think it was a really smart idea to put that one at the end and to include it in this run, as opposed to just having past and present stories, like how they have mainly split it, but to have this one kind of coming in at the end, because you get things in there like Tornos' coffin, which is sort of only really referenced in relation to Tornos again in the story in the epilogue. So actually after we see Teferi use it, but the fact that we've had a relationship with Tornos in these stories through episodes 1 and 2, we know that we've seen Teferi pop in and out of these different stories from episode 2, 3 and 4. We have seen the sort of toll that this has been taking on him in those moments as well. And so the fact that it all comes together and that we revisit all those little moments again in this story is really interesting. The thing that I want to focus on, and again, it seems to happen in every Magic story arc where there is this instance, it always shines out to me to be the best one of the whole run of stories. And that is the one-on-one conversation moment. So the one that always pops into my head is between the Sedgemoor dragon and
Beladros.
Professor Onyx. Yeah, Beladros and Professor Onyx in the Strixhaven stories was easily the best moment in those stories. And yet again, in this one, the conversation between Urza and Teferi, the teacher-student from, thousands of years from this moment being flipped on its head, with Teferi literally saying whether he can lecture at Urza or not. Urza, this tyrant who has literally just destroyed the planet that he was trying to save, actually coming across as, albeit arrogant, something of a thoughtful, emotion-filled, ready to listen, accepting student of Teferi's, and accepting, and even having a moment where he says he's not ready for the fate that Teferi is telling him lies in for Urza.
Yeah,
I think just
I think the line's like thousands of years of this as a question mark. It's like, God, imagine understanding that, and whether or not he's relevant, whether he knows that going out of this moment or not, which I think he doesn't. But just have that moment of contemplation of realizing I've got to deal with thousands upon more years, and also it's really harsh because Teferi's telling him that he fails. He's like, yeah, those fractures you just beat. Nah, mate, they come back a few times.
Yeah.
You fail several times more than this.
Stops short of telling him that he eventually joins the Phyrexians, which I think is an interesting little tidbit. But there's, and obviously, so my point being is that how do we reconcile this in the larger Magic story context? Because you have to have all these big team up moments, like basically what all of the Dominaria United story was just a, hey, let's get the gang all together and do this slightly hollow thing with the Phyrexians. And you have to have the big fight scenes, like we loved, like the two war stories essentially in this were like the two standout ones. But when it all comes down to it, having these very quiet, very thoughtful conversations between characters espousing on the fantasy world that we've all invested in actually come out to be some of the more truthful moments. And obviously it wouldn't work of having just that being every single Magic story, but it is just interesting how it always seems to be the case that when everything kind of gets stripped away, literally in the case of Urza, who is physically and like spiritually a husk and like ready to be reborn into a planeswalker. It's just interesting to me how those are always the moments where I think like, fuck, like these writers really love what they're doing.
Yeah, another moment I guess that was similar to that was the moment between Jason and Emrakul, and it's kind of it gives a voice to the big bad. Like, again, another recent one for this I feel like was when Elishnorn and Ashiok, that the story that we had between the two of them, and then the moment they were speaking, because it gives you a point of view of the antagonist. Which one thing that really annoys me about Magic is you very rarely get to see the antagonist point of view, which creates this very much of they're the bad guy, let's go and beat them, and it's like we're the good guys, we're infallible, and it kind of creates that that parallel kind of thing, which is, I think, annoying, because I'd rather see a little bit of the perspective of Elishnorn, and I'd rather see a bit of perspective of Urza after he's done this. These are the things, the moments you want to see, because it justifies the why, and it justifies the and I guess it humanizes him. This is the very last moment of Urza being human, and it's nice to see that there are humanistic qualities to him, considering we've just seen what his stubbornness and his artifice ability has, what it causes, which is the destruction eventually of the entire world. So it's nice to see, that moment, and it's also nice to give Teferi a chance to kind of talk back with Urza, reflecting on, because the interactions they had back during their histories together, it was very much Teferi being a bit of a douche to him. I mean, rightly so, but like Urza and Teferi both had their moments of being, a bit cunty. So it's quite nice to see them both just having an honest to God conversation about something in a moment it's a really lovely thought that they are literally caught in a moment that shouldn't exist just after the cataclysm. That's such a crazy thing to imagine, being right on the detonation of the Silex. And it kind of made me, like, as I was reading it, my eyes were kind of trying to skip ahead, trying to get to and whilst my brain was saying, no, slow down, we only get this moment every now and again, enjoy it, indulge in it. You can reread it as many times as you want, but it's the first time you're going to be seeing this information kind of spoken about. And I was really shocked when Teferi just started talking about the present day to him. And I was like, do you think I'm going to remember this? And Teferi's like, I don't think so. I don't know, though. No. And obviously, and his line was, I don't think I could still be here if what I'm saying now affected you and affected the future. So they still have this idea of Back to the Future, right? Marty McFlying it, of where anything you do in the past would be actively changing yourself and what you've done in the future, blah 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 blah, cause and effect.
I wonder. I mean, so in general, time travel media is something that I, like many, I'm not alone in this, kind of sort of thinks as a conceit never really works and gets annoyed at when people try to over-explain it too much. And I think they're doing a good job of just going, he's a chrono mage, the Planeswalkers all have enough ability that they can just kind of make it work, and like the sort of they're sticking to the philosophical ideas of what time travel is, rather than trying to be like, this is how time travel actually works, because it's all bollocks anyway. Do you know what I mean? So like,
you're all making
it's all magic.
Exactly,
it's all magic. Just basically, we just trust that the characters know what they're doing. What I really like about in this, to what you're saying about Teferi just starting to blurt out stuff about the future and then going, well, I don't think it'll matter, but it's clearly something that Teferi in this moment thinks he needs to do. And this is something of his character which I think is so consistent and wonderfully consistent since he kind of came back from the sort of shadow of how he was in the 2018 Dominaria stories. This is the same Teferi that warped out Zalfir from the Phyrexian War, because in that moment he was like, this is what I think needs to be done, and he went in and did it. This is the same attitude. He's doing what he's not sure whether it's the right thing to do in terms of right and wrong in the universe, but this is what he thinks is the right thing to do in terms of, morality and all that kind of thing. The difference being is that the Teferi that warped out Zalfir had the arrogance to think that he was infallible and that he was the only one that could do all of this. Whereas Teferi today is making these decisions knowing that, things can go wrong and that the people around him are going to help him through it, which is, doesn't stop him from making these decisions, but definitely gives him more of a grounding and more of an understanding that, I don't know, like the needs do justify the ends, but it's a much calmer, much more lower to the ground attitude than, hey, I can just blip out my entire nation, they'll come back, right? This is a man who's saying, I need to tell my mentor these things because I'm preparing him for what he's about to come. And if it all fucks up, then it all fucks up. But what are we doing this for? I don't know. It just struck me as it is the same character and making the same types of decisions, but from a very different place. At least that's how I read Teferi, anyway.
Absolutely. I feel like the passage that kind of defines this is where he says, Teferi thought of a way. So it says he had to find some way to step beyond, and he thought of a way. It was a risk. Was this not a risk? Everything could go wrong, yes, but back in his time, everything was already wrong. Kharn was gone, the Phyrexians were on Dominaria again, Jaya was dead, and the last redoubt was about to fail. What is the worst that could happen, Teferi thought? The end of the multiverse? ? Which I love, because at that moment I'm like, yes, Teferi, it could actually be the end of the multiverse.
Yeah, but that's the thing, isn't it? That's the thing.
They're already at the end of the multiverse. If the world
they're already in.
Yeah, the World Breaker is going to Realm Breaker, whatever. I keep misnaming. I think it's Realm Breaker. The Phyrexian version of the World Tree, if that actually happens, and it happens in the way that they keep kind of explaining it's going to happen, which is it's going to connect to every plane at once, the same way that the World Tree connects all of the realms of Kaldheim together at once. Like, that is the end of the multiverse. Like, there's a moment that we'll see on the other side of the stories in the chapters rather than the episodes, of where war isn't like as much as we thought Dominaria United was kind of like, oh, it's done, right? You know, Sheoldred kind of got vanquished-ish. Like, you know, she succeeded. She buggered off back to Phyrexia. The war on Dominaria is still ongoing, and it's ongoing everywhere. You know, things aren't actually fine. Things are at our, you know, minute to midnight on the doomsday clock. So I like that, yeah, as you say, it's almost like it's the I hate to say it's the Thanos thing, right? Of where he's the only one with the power to do something about it and the only one with the will to act on it, you know? And again, I'm glad that he took that. He says it's a measured risk, but it's something that he has to do. And because he did do it, then we get these awesome moments. You know, we don't get those, like, I mean, again, if you're going to write fiction and you're going to create these impossible situations where you have someone who can do the impossible thing, make them do the impossible thing and then deal with the consequences afterwards, because you're writing fiction. You might as well push the envelope into something. There's no point going, oh, he could fix the situation, but it might go wrong, so they're actually going to find another way to do it. And I'm like, no, just do it and make the mistake, and then make the characters deal with the fallout. Let your characters die, you know, let people be completed, let Phyrexia win. That's what makes story interesting. You know, there are so many times throughout Magic's history that things have gone really fucking bad, and then they've had to find a way to fix it again. What keeps happening in the modern story is we keep knowing something big and bad is going to be happening, but then they keep stopping it from happening instead of letting it happen and then having to find a way to either deal with the aftermath or fix it. Which is, I think, kind of a nice change that we've seen here, even though it is a story in the past, and even though they did manage to avoid that whole thing of Teferi going in the past and fucking things up. As far as we can tell, he didn't do that. And that's something they very easily could have done. They could have gone, he goes back to the future, and oopsie poople, Urza's still alive. Oh, you know, and Gix and Mishra are here too. Like, the whole gang survived somehow by some timey-wimey bullshit, and they kind of have avoided doing that, which is good, because I think that'd be a massive distraction, especially when,
that's the right word, isn't it? It would have been a distraction.
Yeah.
It would have been a way to get these characters.
Shit to deal with, you know. Like, fine, let Teferi go back. We've done our throwback set. Let's leave the throwback set thrown back. We're getting 3 more Urzas in this set. We're getting 3 new Mishras in this set. We don't need them in the modern set. We did it. We even got a little bit of Urza talking. This is almost the perfect amount of a throwback in my mind. Like, I don't think, considering how much of a risk it could have been, I don't think they could have done it better. Let's see how the fucking set comes out and whether or not it destroys standard / commander or / modern or whatever. But from a narrative point of view,
I'm
really
excited
nice
for the aesthetic, like, sort of just talking a little bit about the cards. I mean, I know I've said this in previous episodes as well, like the sort of Geiger-esque body horror, the mech punk, because it's not quite steampunk, because it is more like, the power stones aren't more like steam, they are more like nuclear energy, aren't they? So I guess you could call it like nuclear punk. But like this kind of mech aesthetic is definitely my jam, and I'm excited to see it in Magic. I cannot wait. There's far more my jam than, say, the cyberpunk stuff of Neon Dynasty. And I love sci-fi and I love cyberpunk, but I think I vibe more towards this kind of grimier, grittier sort of aesthetic, of like futurist aesthetic. So yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing it in my decks. I can't wait to build something of like a War Machine deck, which I know have existed before, because we've had these kinds of aesthetics in Magic. Correct me if I'm wrong, the Dragon Engine in Sword 1 is Traxos, right?
I believe so. What we've seen with it's not the Phyrexian Dragon Engine we've seen already kind of spoiled with
Mishra. Yeah, it's not Mishra's
that's
Dragon
a different
Engine,
one,
no.
Because that's the one that happens right at the end of the story, right in the last story, that he melds with and then attacks Urza, and that's what causes Urza to then pour himself into the Silex, the visage of Mishra fused with this Dragon Engine. And it's not, there's another Dragon Engine in the artwork, which is the Phalaji Dragon Engine, which is a different looking flying one. I really hope we get a Traxos. I don't see why they wouldn't give us a Traxos, considering the Scourge of Krug card was a throwback already. You know?
Yeah, like
nice to see
Traxos Scourge of Krug is the problem with getting multiples of the same legendary is, unless they have new story that's pushing it forward, it doesn't really, it's kind of always a little bit like, are we just getting different takes because you didn't like the way you designed the first one? And sometimes that's fine, like with the Urza card.
I guess flavor-wise, the Scourge of Krug doesn't untap. It requires someone else. You know, it requires a historic spell to be cast for it to untap. So it's almost like Rundown. I'd like to see it without that.
Because Traxos
kind of doesn't untap ability.
Yeah, I guess you're right. I guess the Traxos Scourge of Krug card was because in the world of Dominaria 2018, that was something that was uncovered in the present day.
Yeah.
They unearthed him, and so it was like,
we don't know
look
if
at this relic.
We don't know if that's one that maybe Rona was using in the modern Dominaria United story, for example. It's not named as being Traxos, but then we don't know if any of the fractions named. I mean, we know the name of it, but maybe that was named from the people of Crew calling it Traxos, or maybe it was rather than the name Phyrexians gave it. So maybe we could see it in the modern day, all fire and brimstone, actually, killing peeps. But...
Couple of nice little moments from the stories, just to, I guess, wrap up, because I think we're kind of heading that way. Little reference to Nabiz, the drink that we mentioned in our menu of the Multiverse episode. So you should know what Nabiz is, dear listener, if you've listened to that episode, which was kind of cool because obviously we're on old Dominaria and that's what they drank on old Dominaria.
And the soldiers got super excited about it as well, which is really nice.
The soldiers got super excited about it.
The moment was like, don't get excited about it. They're only giving us all of these supplies, so we're strong to go and attack tomorrow.
Yeah,
which
so
is
we're
another galling part of war. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's like how they used to they still do, obviously, because they used to, as if that doesn't happen. But the fact that soldiers get completely blotto on like speed and coke and they get sent over the top. Anyway, dark thought there. Also, when the Gix Phyrexians start trawling the battlefield in the same episode at the end when the dust settles, and it's those kind of more slicker looking robed folk who are the Gixians, and one of them looks at the Teferi time coast and goes, "Are you the one from our dream?"
Right, this is what then freaks Teferi. He's like, and it's visions of Gix. They had visions of Gix, right? And the idea is that Gix does eventually become like a big part of the story as well. And it's just kind of interesting that Teferi's just having all of these accidental, like, who knows what that thought and that Gixian looking at him, that who knows what that then caused to happen in the Church of Gix? Who knows? Maybe. Yeah. It's great. That was a Ouija bit. Yeah.
Anything for you? Any nice little moments?
The only other one I had, because I've mentioned a few of the ones already, was Teferi accidentally creating ghost stories and being mistaken for death. So the similar vein of where it kind of felt a little bit twee in the moment, because it was kind of like a random. Oh, also Teferi popped up at the end. I'm like, okay, great. Is that the only reason why we had a whole episode on this particular battle? Is because right at the end, Teferi happens to come along. I actually kind of liked that it created a ghost story that permeated. I liked that he was perceived as death, and then it made the soldier go, you know what? Not today, fine, I believe you. And then he would have died, and then he didn't. So I like this idea. And also, I like the idea specifically that it's only because of Saheeli's, Kaya's, and Teferi's individual abilities that this is possible. I know that you touched on that just a second ago, and it's the only reason why can't they do this again next week? Like, it's really hard. It's very difficult. We'll see in the chapters how difficult it is for them to actually succeed at this. And we see it quite a lot in episode 5. They're having to like keep going back. So yeah, I mean it was nice. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, it was the same soldier in that episode 3 who sees the Teferi time ghost. That is then the old man in episode 4, Ayman. It's the same soldier.
Exactly. Which is so nice that we get a little bit of like, and that's what I liked as well. So the timey-wimey stuff is like episode 1 and 2 was technically set after the other episodes because they happen after the Cataclysm, whereas then episode 3, 4, and 5 are kind of Teferi getting closer to, because I think he went too far. Initially, in his first throwback, he went too far beyond, which is why we see episode 1 and 2, and then he went, okay, let's go to the other end and work our way towards it, which is why then we got episodes 3, 4, and 5 in that order, which is quite nice. It's almost like doing it from Teferi's point of view, even though we spend very little time in Teferi's point of view.
Yeah, exactly. We are Teferi looking at these moments in time.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, then. Right, well, thank you so much for listening to our story breakdown of this half. I think we actually did quite efficiently. Tell us your thoughts on these episodes for the Brothers' War. What do you think of this set? First throwback set, first sort of set of throwback stories as mainline stories, as opposed to one-offs, how they used to do on the Magic website. Let us know via our Twitter at MTFlavoring. Emails go to mtflavoring@gmail.com. My personal Twitter is at AndyManface. Nathan's, yours is?
At the Fox in the Moon.
Yeah. I'm excited. I think this set is going to absolutely rip. I think it's going to be fantastic to play. I think it's going to be aesthetically a really strong set. I think the stories have proven that the narrative is really strong as well. Who knew? A story that's already sort of been told with new spin. Like, that's actually a pretty good way to go. And I am definitely looking way more forward to this than I looked forward to and received Dominaria United. Sorry, Dominaria United. You were just fine.
It was Dominaria. It was the Dominaria set part 2, and part 1 unfortunately just had all of the good songs on it, and the B-sides weren't so good, which is unfortunate. Exactly. I would like to see. I don't know how they'll be able to do it, because obviously narratively there was a reason why we did a throwback to this set, and I know that we've said we wouldn't mind seeing other parts. Like, I would love to see the Thran back at the Thran, for example, or for example we talked about the Blood Age and Strixhaven. I don't know how they'll be able to do it, because it seems they only did this for narrative reasons. It would be nice to see other ones, and I guess all we need to do is show the support for this set to show that there's a reason to do it again in the future.
Yeah, cool. All right then, well, other than that, all that remains for me to say is thank you so much for listening. This has been Magic the Flavouring.
We'll see you soon.